So here with me today is Jack Reed. Jack Reed is I think of him as a mystic. He's a global visionary. He's the author of a book, The Next Evolution, a blueprint for transforming the planet. He's a speaker, he's a seminar leader, consultant to corporations and nonprofits. He is a trainer in the consensus process. And he is a proponent of what is called the highest good of all. He also has 15 years experience living in an urban cooperative community where he was an active leader. And the knowledge and experience that he gained from that have been put to good use by the Wilderness Institute, Amgen, the Educare Foundation, the Peace Theological Seminary, the University of Southern California, the Los Angeles Unified School District, Southern Cal Edison, National Park Service, and many others. Jack also facilitates consensus trainings for the One Community team and brings a tremendous wealth of wisdom about how we can have a sustainable planet and a blueprint for people living and creating something that he refers to as the highest good of all. So maybe we could start there, Jack. If anything I just said is inaccurate, please correct me. But maybe we could start with your description. What is the highest good of all, or for all?
Well, we've been living in a world that has been based on an every person for themselves paradigm in terms of the major models. And it's been unquestioned for thousands of years. And they're all, I have a saying in my book that you take democracy, capitalism, communism, socialism, they're all much more alike than they are different because they're all centralized power-based systems. And what we're talking about is doing something that returns the decision-making to the people on the local level and empowering them all through making decisions that can be based on consensus, where everybody holding that consciousness of the highest good for all can come into agreement that they all embrace and they all support. Right now, in democracy, for instance, there's a quote in my book from Gandhi. He says he doesn't believe in the majority rule system because as the voting takes place, people get disenfranchised if they're in the minority, and then another vote and more people get enfranchised, and then pretty soon everybody considers that they're in the minority and people don't support their interests. And so people end up voting against somebody as the least, as the most reprehensible, and supporting the person who they consider the least. But rarely do they get behind a unanimity in supporting somebody who really they feel like has all their best interests at heart. And that's the trouble. To be a responsible citizen nowadays, somebody'd have to have a full-time staff of people investigating everything because otherwise we can't be informed. There's just too much going on and there's too much money involved. There's too much nefarious influence involved. And so I believe that the whole social, economic, political systems are broken, and they're broken beyond repair, and we need to do something different. There's a quote that many people use, and it's on the back of my book, from Bucky Fuller, which is, in order to change something, don't struggle to change the existing model, create a new one, and make the old one obsolete. And it's that model, that new model, that needs to be created to show people what is possible, because people have no idea what it would look like and how it would work for people to be living together and relating together on the basis of the highest good for all.
So that highest good for all, you mentioned the word consensus. It sounds like it's something that is inclusive of everyone's voice. I just wonder how in such a diverse country like the US, it would be possible for us to truly reach a consensus about decisions that we would make.
Yes, that's excellent. There are people who I've talked with over the years who have said, well, we tried consensus in our community and it didn't work. And we have a consensus, intentional community, and we tried it. And there was always a couple of people who were blocking it. Well, the key factor in being able to do consensus is that people need to be trained to do it, and they need to be screened to do it. One of my quotes, which I think is an original quote, is you can't have a utopian society without utopian people, because otherwise it's just making rules for people to follow. For instance, I asked people, what's the key factor in the whole issue of sustainability? Where people are talking about, well, we need to be doing recycling, we need to get into off fossil fuels and into alternative energy, and they're talking about all this stuff. And I say, the key factor is consciousness, because people of consciousness will do whatever it takes. And if we have people trained in consensus decision making and screened for holding that consciousness of the highest good for all, screen for that so that the people who are participating have that consciousness, then consensus becomes rather easy to do. In our consensus trainings that we researched, and that was originally offered through the Peace Theological Seminary, as Carol Jones had that as her second year USM project. So she asked me to come in because of the work that we were doing with consensus with Community Planet. So what we focused on, and as the trainings have evolved a lot since that time, is we focus on the consciousness that it takes to do it. Most of the consensus trainings focus on technique, what to do if somebody blocks, do you being in voting at some point. It's focus on the consciousness that it takes to do that, because people of consciousness will be able to do it if they embrace the highest good for all, and they just keep checking things out. And if people aren't in alignment, then creativity is necessary. I tell the story of, I don't know if you remember Vicki Miller, but she was one of the people who was the original people in the Community Planet and vision. And as the group of us created that vision, we did all our decisions by consensus. And so we were moving through the descriptions of things and what it would look like and how it would work. And we get to this point a couple of times where the rest of us would say, yeah, that's it, we've got it. And Vicki would just say, well, that's not it. And we'd say, well, what do you mean it's not it? What's missing? What do we need to do differently? I don't know. The only thing that I know is that's not it. And so we couldn't go any further. And the next week we'd get together again, we'd meet again, hoping that Vicki had changed her mind. But Vicki would still say, no, it's not it. And so at that point, because we were friends and we had senses of humor, we just start throwing out crazy ideas, just absurd kind of stuff, just to have fun with it, because we were stuck and we couldn't go any further. And as we did that, somebody'd say something, and then it would hit a spark, and we'd just take off on that, and we'd get to a level of decision that was beyond where we were willing to settle for. And at that point, Vicki would say, that's it. Now, how often in the decision-making process anywhere would that kind of intuition be respected? somebody would have to state their position, defend their position, and instead we had somebody who was very intuitive, holding out for something that was for the greater good or the higher good of all, and that would force the rest of the group into being more creative and getting into a decision that was far superior to the one that we were willing to settle for. So things like that are possible if people hold that consciousness, if the rest of the people respect that consciousness, and we can go for creating those kinds of things. It just happens. It doesn't happen anywhere in government in the United States, unless it can happen on some of these intentional communities that I wouldn't know if it was happening there or not.
So what it occurs to me is you've used this word consciousness, and when I think of consciousness, I think that there are just different kinds of consciousness. So, right, there could be a very kind of narrow-minded consciousness. There could be a very expansive, higher power type of consciousness. So when you say consciousness, you described a process where the consensus really worked in honoring this intuitive approach. How would you describe this kind of consciousness?
Well, very simply, as I said, it's really holding the consciousness of the highest good for all. We're programmed so much to take care of number one and make decisions for ourselves and to help with everybody else. And it's really embracing, I'll have to get a little esoteric here, is the consciousness that everything is one thing.
Yeah.
So we're all in this together, and if everything is one thing, then you and I are all part of that one thing. We're kind of like the same, different cells in the consciousness of one body, and that's what people really are. I was at the beach one day, and I was reading a John Roger discourse, and the idea hit me about how everything is one thing. And at that point, I thought, well, let me pretend like I'm God over this planet. And I kind of rose above the planet, and then I looked down at all the cells of my body that were doing all these seemingly horrendous things to one another. And aware that these are all parts of my cells in my body, I'm looking down at that and thinking, I created this, and now look what these parts of myself are doing to one another, not knowing that it's all one, it's all me. And I thought how uproariously funny that was, that these parts of me were doing these things to one another. And it's not like me to laugh out loud when I'm alone, when I'm reading or imagining something. And I just laughed for probably 5 minutes there alone on the beach. And then every time I thought about it for days afterwards, I would just start laughing, because the perspective of what we're doing here on this planet, forgetting that we're all connected one. So let's just make this work for everyone.
Yeah.
And, I got into that consciousness when I was 15 years old, which is how I first got inspired about thinking about what could the planet do to where it could work for everyone. And I read a book on the communities of the continent of Lemuria and how they cooperated together, how they held that consciousness. And I thought, yeah, if that could be demonstrated, if a group of people large enough could get together and demonstrate that consciousness, that loving connection, then the rest of the world could see that and say, these people are living far better than I am, but what do I need to do to get from where I am to get to be part of that? It's like, the first step change the consciousness. So it's okay to say, let's just make this work for everyone involved.
Now, in your book, you give the example of the kibbutz in Israel, which is a cooperative kind of communal society. And I'm thinking that the kibbutzim have lost a lot of their steam and power and forward movement, and have kind of become mostly irrelevant in the state of Israel today. Is there something about that kind of approach? Have they just lost sight of the highest good, or did they not ever really embrace that as a characteristic?
I don't know what they did in terms of screening for consciousness for the people who were on the kibbutz, so I could not speak to that.
So this is about screening, and I would guess that your one community, you've assisted them with some kind of a screening tool for this.
Yes, I've done a couple of consensus trainings for some of the people involved with one community, and as they progressively get further along, we will have consensus trainings for everyone and use that as a screening tool.
Yeah, so you just see how the person responds to what they're presented in this consensus training.
Yes, because it'll be very easy to see in the court. This is not a weekend training. This is 40 hours, and I'd love to do a train the trainer training so that we get a lot of people out there who know how to do these kinds of trainings, so that we can move people more into that consciousness, because I can't do myself and my partner and my co-facilitator, we can't do everybody. So people need to be trained to be able to do that. And there's a lot of talented people out there who will be even better than I am.
Well, I wanted to ask you, in terms of a model for organizations, are you familiar with something called holacracy, which is what was applied to the Zappos shoe company? A very decentralized, not at all top down, where people just take individual responsibility for what it is they're doing within the organization. So it sounds like this has some similarities to that.
It may. I'm not that familiar with holacracy.
Okay. And then we've had kind of a history of utopian literature. We've had intentional communities. Certainly the United States as the new world, so to speak, was the experiment for a lot of Europeans trying to come together intentionally. And is it just as simple as they were trying to be top down and EFT that took them off track, or what would we look to and say, oh, we don't want to make that mistake that they made?
First of all, for the audience, when Peter referred to EFT, that means everyone for themselves. That's the model that's opposed to the highest good for all model. And again, I don't know much about the consciousness that those people held that were trying those various experiments, but it only takes a couple of people that do not hold that consciousness to where they can sabotage the whole endeavor. So, and historically, I don't know what happened, because I don't know the consciousness that the people came in with, or if there were people who basically ruined what they were trying to do.
If this is kind of a school for the souls that come in to work in, and if it is kind of under a negative power, how on earth does something so idyllic as holding the highest good for all in terms of an entire community over decades or hundreds of years spans. How on earth is that possible?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for people listening because, and there's a quote in my book, the biggest mistake in communication is the illusion that it has actually occurred. Because we're all listening through our filters. And if we're talking about the kind of intentional community model here that Community Planet and our partners at One Community are proposing, very few people would have the same concept of what that is in their minds without us painting a real picture of what that is. So I think it might be important to talk about how this differs from so that the listener can see what it is that we're doing. Now, first of all, it's based on that consciousness. It's based on the people who are there as residents or resident decision makers. We could have guests in there who are learning, but not necessarily involved in the decision making until they reach that place of consciousness where they're ready to do that. So that's who the people are who are involved in the decision making. And firstly, everybody does not own their house. They don't own their yard. They own the community. So they don't have to enclose space, like this is mine, I need to put as much stuff inside these four walls as possible because this is my space and my stuff. The idea is the whole community is ours. The people in the co-housing movement, when the people who wrote Builders of the Dawn, which was about co-housing, I think that was it. Anyway, they went back years later and they interviewed the people who had built these co-housing units, and they said, what would you do differently if you had it to do all over again? And unanimously, the people said, we'd build less personal space and more group space, because we just don't need that much personal space if the whole community is ours. We don't need to have so much stuff if we can redefine wealth as use and access rather than ownership. So I don't need a tennis court in my backyard. I don't need a swimming pool in my backyard. In the community, we can just have access to all these things through just being available within the community. Not everybody needs to have their own tennis racket. Nobody needs to have their own recreational equipment as long as they have access to it. People who are into musical instruments, they don't all need to have their own musical instrument, which go and use about close to 100% of the time. They just need to have access. And in the community, they not only can have access, but they have a place where they can get together with other people to creatively engage in those things. And people who are into sports and play and games in a community where people are cooperating together, these things can happen all the time among loving people who we know and connect with and have fun with. And the community can have plays that they put on and create. They can have eating. They can have small kitchenettes in their own place if they choose to. When I say their own place, I mean the place where they're living. But there can be community dining, or people can have their own choice. And most all the food is grown locally. It's all organic. And everything the community buys is all the top-rate health. And health practitioners are there for anybody to go to anytime they want, as opposed to people now thinking, do I have enough money to pay for going to see this person? The whole healthcare conversation in this country is crazy, because they're talking about, is the one-payer system, is it this or that? let's make healthcare inexpensive by getting everybody well, for God's sake. And that never took place in the conversation. There's all kinds of things that people can do to have better health. And that kind of coaching and that kind of nutrition will be available for everybody within the community. And the one, when it comes to working, for instance, in this country, politically, they say, and economically, they say, we need more jobs. We need to create more jobs, more jobs. And it's crazy because 85% of the jobs that exist only exist because of the every person for themselves system. In a cooperative system, all those jobs get eliminated. And people have way more free time. And that's one of the things that will be a real draw to this community when people outside say, geez, these people are having a lot more fun. They're being a lot more creative. They're a lot more loving. They're a lot more abundant on all levels because they have access to all these things and they have time to do these things and they have more connection with nature because we build nature into the community as opposed to what we do in these metropolitan concrete jungle areas. And the people looking at this and they're saying, what do I need to do to get from where I am to get to be a part of this? And that's what draws people in. And at first, because you mentioned, would people try and stop this? They're not going to try and stop this with the first community because it'll be just one community. They'll barely notice anything's happening. But if one community the next year creates two more, and those two create two more, and in less than 30 years, the whole planet, 8 billion people get covered on just that basis. And what we're talking about here is communities of 500 people, because that's about the optimum level of where we can still do consensus within those communities and have everybody have a real voice. And then we put a cluster of, say, 6 of those together. So we have 3,000 people in one place in 6 different communities of 500 people. And these people have access to everything that they want to do. So that's where the real abundance gets built in, because people go to cities now because they say, well, I can't do this thing that I want to do in the country because it's too big. I need to go to a city where there's more access to these kinds of things. Well, in a community of that size, we can have access to just about everything that anybody wants to do. And
well, that brings up a good point in terms of, because there would be a lot less driving cars and commuting, it sounds like. And so if we look, the 20 years roughly since this book came out and where we are today. So we could say, Jack talked in his book 20 years ago about how a lot of kind of make work, irrelevant jobs would go away. And I would, from where I look, I think that's happened. And with AI, very much so. And you mentioned that in the book 20 years ago, AI doing that. So we're seeing that. And then with this virus slowdown, we've also gotten to see how, as a community, a big community of all the humans on the earth, we can be kinder to Mother Earth by less unnecessary output of toxic things and the like. And then we've also noticed how connected we are through this slowdown, and people have, it seems like they valued being at home and valued, communicating with their families, and that it almost seems to me like it's a little bit of an exercise in what you've been talking about.
Yeah, along with that, everybody's needs are going to be taken care of within a cooperative community. And one thing you mentioned that is important too is these would be predominantly pedestrian communities, because the cars could all be parked in one space. And for a community of 500 people, how many cars would be needed? Maybe 30? And yet here we have basically a car per every adult. And 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 the cars go unused most of the time. And commuting would be where people uh, spend however much time some people spend 2 hours a day commuting. Well, in a community, people would be living there, working there within walking distance. Cars would be for leaving the community, and you just need access to one to be able to drive away to do things that when people want to do things. And so,
Yeah. So this one community that you're talking about, and that is kind of in a nascent stage. How long ago did that first kind of come into congeal into something that was going to happen?
well, one community is directed by and founded by a friend of mine named Jay Sable. He's become my friend ever since he connected with me. And he says that we share the same brain because we hold exactly the same vision. And that's why on one community's amazing website, one can get lost in there for weeks. They've got so much stuff on there. It's all open source. But they've got a community designed down to the nuts and bolts of things. So they have put together the what it would look like and how it could be built aspect of this to be shared everywhere so that anyone on earth could take anything that they have and be able to replicate it. And Community Planet has come in more with the consciousness piece. So it's a great marriage. And as they're winding down towards having everything done in terms of the design and the building materials and everything else, getting in a position for them to be able to acquire a piece of land that they've had their eyes on where this could be built. So I'm excited about that. And I'm just so thankful for Jay Sable and One Community, because that's a piece that I didn't have. And they have hundreds of volunteer people from all of the world who've been working with them and putting together this vision.
Looks like almost every continent when you look at the website.
Yeah.
And it looks like really amazing high-level people that are really effective in the world, and they've been attracted to this coming together. So, I mean, would I be too far off if I described it this way? There's this guy, Jack Reed, and he meets a pretty cool guy back in the early 60s, mid 60s, who inspires him spiritually. But even before that, he was kind of having this vision of this, how the planet could work in a better way. And he's been holding this vision just very, very consistently and very willing to share it with others however he can. And then, lo and behold, this other One Community thing sprouts up after Jack's been holding this vision for a very long time. Would I be somewhat accurate to give it that kind of description?
Yeah, it sounds pretty accurate.
So, how long ago did you meet Jay Sable?
I think about maybe 7 years ago.
Yeah, so that's you had been holding this for what, 50, 60 years, and then this comes along.
Yeah, there was what got me started on really putting together the vision, which I'd held in my mind in a kind of an idealized state for a couple of decades. And then in 1985, I was at presentation at the University of Santa Monica that was being facilitated by Michael Fader and David Allen, because they were, at that time, the People Center was a thing. And as I sat there in the audience with another fellow resident of Prana and was listening to everybody talk about the People Center, I realized that people had no idea, even within the movement of spiritual inner awareness, people had no idea what this could really be. And so I thought, okay, so now we've got to describe it so that people can get it. And that's what I got a group of people together for a Peace Theological Seminary class. And we worked for 3 years on putting together the vision that is in that book.
Now, the 15 years that you worked this process in a community, was that at what you call Prana?
Yes, I came to Prana in 1978 to 1983.
And so were you actually involved in a, I'll call it governance for lack of a better word, but governance of the community through a consensus process?
We eventually, the Prana administrator eventually asked me, because I was what they called the steering director. So I was the chief of the residents, the chief decision maker, and I facilitated the weekly meetings, or I guess bi-monthly at that point meetings. And I was asked to do it with consensus, but the problem was, and I kept learning every time I was trying something, I kept learning that one of the reasons why it was difficult was not everybody had been through the consensus process at that point, though it had been offered to everybody. So there was people who did not hold the consciousness, and then trying to do it as a whole group, as opposed to limiting it to smaller subgroups with individual facilitators within the groups, to try and do it as a whole group without having the people trained and screened. It was not that effective.
But it sounds like it was a laboratory where you learned a lot that you
Yeah.
applied to your trainings.
Yeah, I'd come away from every one of those meetings thinking, okay, what needs to be done differently here?
So that brings up another question I had. So I have I've trained in law school way of thinking. So when you were describing how it would work with people participating in a community, there was a distinction between someone who is at a level where their voice is, in a sense, counted directly toward decisions, and then also guests. So I was just trying to imagine a situation, because human beings are biological beings, and sometimes our brains can go through a process where it could affect our consciousness. And so I was just imagining a situation, someone who's a nice, trusted decision maker, biologically something happens so that they're not really in the same place where they need to be in consensus. And then the process of inviting them into something called being a guest, as opposed to being someone who's a decision maker, and how that would work if their voice is fully counted in the consensus. So you see, I've got myself in a little dilemma here with the governance.
Okay, well, that's one of the positions that is not going to be needed as much in a cooperative society as lawyers.
Understood. Understood.
So in chapter 4 in the book, where we go the 12 areas that describe the community, and the first one we have, I think, is called, it's either the first or the second, is how do we reach consensus? And the group of us who put this vision together, we thought a lot about things like this. And first of all the residents would be in a group of, their individual groups of up to 12 people. And we called those the essence hubs. And these would be groups of people who, from many different sections of the community, but probably friends, but maybe working in different areas. They would come together weekly for a meeting amongst themselves just to check in, to see how everybody's doing, and everybody's supported and what people's needs are. And so people will know what's going on with everyone else in the community, as opposed to where we are now, where there's so much isolation. Barbara Marx Hubbard once said something that I completely agreed with, that I thought the biggest issue on the planet was isolation and alienation. And the phone just rang. I got distracted for a second. So she said the biggest issue was separation. I said, yeah, that puts it into one word. People feel separated. And when they get separated, people don't know what's going on with other people. So there's these people who can go off in their minds and get distracted and start having issues. And in the community, that will basically be impossible, because people will know what's happening with everybody. And besides the essence hubs, then there's other hubs that are within the work areas in the community that are called focus hubs. And these are people who work together in, it could be agriculture, it could be healthcare, it could be whatever that area is. So there's the essence hubs, people with representatives into the main hub. And then there's the focus hubs. And so people are kind of checks and balances, even amongst themselves, because they're representing a focus hub here, they're representing their essence hubs here. And so that's our system. We just imagined every possible kind of thing that could be going on within, and that separation that can create problems. People will know that. And one of the things I like to say too is, now when people become have physical or mental issues that make them basically non-functional, that their job within the community would be to be that person who needs to be taken care of. That would be their job. That would be their contribution to the community, was being a person who needs to be taken care of. And that is so different from what we're doing now, where I hope this person has money and to be able, otherwise we'll just put them in an old age home where we have minimum wage people working, taking care of people, because that's the job that they can get, and there's no nourishment and there's no connection, and these people fade away real quickly, as opposed to, let's not do that. That's one of my real pet peeves, is to take people who are disenfranchised groups of people and to put them all in one place, to say, okay, let's put them over there and not have to take care of them. No, this will be an intergeneration group of people, and people who are older will still be making a contribution. We won't be shuffling them off to some retirement home, but the people, they'll be an integral part of this community up until the day that they choose to leave the planet.
Well, it sounds beautiful. As you were describing these hubs and this organization, I remembered a book I read called 2150. I don't know if you ever
Oh
read
yeah,
that.
I met the author one time.
And this sounds very familiar. It's kind of a macro approach as opposed to the micro EFT approach.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm curious. I understand that if things spread as fast as you described, in 30 years, our entire planet of 8 billion people are living this way. And I understand that's what visionaries do. Visionaries have visions, and so I guess the part of me that's been on the planet for 62 years and has had some dreams and visions dashed along the way. I'm curious, what is it about your way of approaching being a human being that you're able to so steadfastly hold to this very enlightened positive vision, not just for yourself, but for all mankind, humankind?
I think I just came in with it. It's I describe it as being beyond passion because it's not something that I'm passionate about. It's just something that, okay, there's this job to do, and so let's do it. It's I think if we got any group of people on the planet who have any kind of a consciousness of that goes beyond just themselves, that if they really got together and explored the kind of model that they could come up with where it would really work for everyone and work for the planet. And we're talking about restoring the planet's environment, which is probably the major threat that's happening beyond everything else. I think that just about anybody, any group of those people, if they spent enough time with it, that they'd come up with a similar vision. As a matter of fact, I've had any number of people tell me when they've read the book, they said, well, that's exactly the vision that I've had. I just hadn't put it into words, but that's the vision. I said, yeah, because you hold that consciousness of the highest good for all. And so when you read this, of course you would resonate with this. So I say, feel free to claim ownership of it, because I'm not attached to it. I just want it to happen.
So it sounds like what you're describing is really a universally applicable and in a way universally conceived approach that would really fit in any one human organism's consciousness in any moment. It would be applicable. So if I'm, just getting up from my chair and going to do something, it's almost informed by this highest good of all concern. And shifting off of the EFT. Now, in a way, we had a leader in biblical history, Moses, and he was essentially told that those EFT people would all have to die off before the next iteration of what God wanted could happen. So is there anything to this vision where you say, well, there is a certain level being held by certain people, they're not going to make it. This is going to be for some other people.
Well, it depends on how long they're going to be on the planet and what stage these communities are at as they start spreading. Obviously, some people still won't be around when it gets to everybody on the planet. So if everything's one thing, it doesn't really matter anyway. But it's, if they come back in another lifetime and come back to the planet, they may be coming back to a very different planet than the one that they left. So, let's just have fun while we're doing it. So, not going to get too serious about it.
Well, I get that. I get that it's, many of the kind of idealistic, visionary type people I've encountered have kind of an urgency. We have this choice and we must do this now, and it's urgent, and that's one of the delightful things I notice about your message is that it seems to line up with a spiritual teaching I've heard, which is there's no urgency in spirit with a big S.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. There's no urgency in spirit.
Yeah, and just that really takes a lot of the pressure off. That allows a lot of the joy and the spontaneity to come through. So I'm answering my question for myself, and I'm kind of saying if Jack were coming from that more push urgency approach with all this, I think he would have worn himself out. But I think the fact that Jack's had this, there's no urgency in spirit. This is very joyful. It's very spirit led. That's how I would describe the difference. That could make you so willing to stay with this for so long and be quite okay with whatever the progress is.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm really heartened that there is this one other group of people that I know about that is doing the same thing.
And they're very boots on the ground, practical, pragmatic.
Yep.
And so it seems like that could be a good opportunity. So what would you think a consensus training group size, what would be an ideal size for a consensus training?
Well, if it was more than 12 people, it'd have to be, when we're doing some of the processes would have to be broken. Actually, some of the consensus decisions themselves, where they're practicing things, they have to be broken into groups of not more than 12. So we could do a training, say with 2 facilitators, we could do a training of 24 people and then break it down into 2 groups of 12. So other than that, it would just be a group of, if it was just one group, it'd be a group of up to 12.
And now with this Zoom technology, you wouldn't have too many limits on geography with it.
I'd prefer to do it in person, but that's why it'd be great to have people come together for a train-the-trainer training, and then have those people to be able to go out in different places. I think something is lost if it's just Zoom. For instance, when I did the training with one community, we all stayed in the same place and in the same big apartment. And most of us were sleeping out in the living room, and we were making meals together. And so it was not just people coming into the class, but it was just people really getting to know one another and having fun together outside of just the process itself. And I think that really contributes a lot to people's experience and to accessing that consciousness.
And so what would you tell people that are, kind of confronting the difficulties of this current moment, where there's a little bit of what people would call divisiveness in the political system in the U.S. and a kind of a renewed attention to things that have been called Black Lives Matter, and then this, challenge to the healthcare system? How would you see your vision kind of helping people through a time like this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting um, how people grow up and the groups of people that they grow up with, because it gets back again to this idea of separation. And if people grew up being able to relate to other people as people, regardless of what they look like, they have a disability, if they're male, if they're female, the shades of their skin, or anything else. If we get to connect in a loving way with people as people, then we get beyond that whole thing. And now, that being said, historically in the United States, of course, people have been disenfranchised, and they're not the first group. They're not the first or the only group. The indigenous population of the Americas has been uh, it's a very similar thing. But I get it that people have had their opportunities taken from one another, and I get it that, for instance, I was thinking about one time years ago when I was young, and I was driving my then girlfriend back in the car, and I kind of got lost on the way to her house, and it was late at night, and I went down this cul-de-sac, which was a dead end, and all of a sudden there were 4 cop cars there, and asking me what I was doing. I was just trying to get home. Now, if I'd have been a black guy with a black girlfriend, or even the white girlfriend if I was, there would have been hell to pay at that moment. So I get it that people have had very, very different experiences, and that people could get into power positions, think that they can do just about anything. But again, these the people in the power positions, they're not screened for consciousness in terms of in terms of being able to look at everybody as another human being in this family that we of our collective oneness. So it's a real broken model. And again, within the communities such as we're describing, I don't think there'd be any need for law enforcement whatsoever, because people in these groups that are meeting together and know one another, they know who these people are, and these people have been screened for consciousness. So that's one job that does not need to exist, would be law enforcement within these communities. The one job that we need more of course, is more masseuses and masseurs, because I think everybody needs to be massaged more regularly than they are now.
That's a nice vision to hold for us, Jack. I appreciate that. Is there anything that, just in terms of, it's 20 years after the book came out, and we're, doing a pandemic and Black Lives Matter and all this, is there anything that would really be amiss if we hadn't covered it today?
No, I just want people to imagine, and if they can't do it themselves, they could get the book. It's on Kindle now, as a matter of fact, or they could go to the communityplanet.org website and contact me there. And if they can't afford the $3 or whatever it is, that I'll just email it to them to just get what this vision is, that about how we could be living completely different. Because if they can get that vision in their mind, I want to be there, because that's the attraction. When people can have more abundant lives on all levels, have more free time for enjoyment, that they don't have to come home in their isolated lives and think, what am I going to do for entertainment tonight? I was working all day, I commuted, and now the easiest thing to do is just sit in front of the television and watch some shows. But in the community, they're okay, there's all these people to connect with. What do I want to do tonight? Do I want to play games? Do I want to play some cards? Do I want to go and watch a play? Do I want to participate in creating a play? Do I want to do music, sports? There's whatever it is that people want to do, there's other people there to do it with and to have fun with it. And that's why there's a quote in the book, we've got to start living, we've got to start learning to live with more fun in our lives, because fun has been taken out of a lot of people's lives. And one of the key things about being in this community is how much fun it's going to be there, how much more empowered people are going to be by taking the decision making back into their own hands, because they know within that community and the way the community decision making is set up that their needs are going to be considered, that they're not going to be a minority and left out. So if people don't have that vision of what it would look like and how it would work, so get the book, and you don't have to even pay for it if you contact me. But if you want to contribute something that's helpful for Community Planet, but if you don't, that's okay too, because I didn't do that to make money. I did that to get the vision out there so that we can all help transform this planet and create a world that works for everyone.
Thank you, Jack. This has been really interesting and uplifting and inspiring. I really appreciate you taking the time today. May you continue to be blessed with your wonderful vision, and may it be just as communicable as this coronavirus.
Okay, and I would invite you to say, because I can tell that you get it, it's not just my vision, it's our vision.
Our vision. Thank you very much, young man.
Okay, it's been a joy, Peter. Thank you.